On the night of July 18, 1958, blood was already being spilled over a strip of land in Montana. By dawn, the first rancher would be found dead near a disputed boundary line. Before the week was over, others would follow. By the time the dispute ended, 15 men would be dead. All of them had been part of the same agreement. What was supposed to settle ownership instead detonated years of resentment between neighboring ranchers who had lived side by side, armed with silence and grudges. The contract didn't fail quietly. It tore open a conflict that had been waiting for a reason to turn violent. Montana authorities would later describe what followed as a rapid collapse of order. Meetings turned into threats. Warnings became confrontations. Each death traced back to a moment when someone decided that backing down meant losing everything. This was no longer about landlines on a map. It was about dominance. And once the first body fell, there was no turning back. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. The land agreement was supposed to end the tension. For nearly a decade, the stretch of grazing land outside the small Montana town had been a quiet source of conflict. Fences were moved inches at a time. Water rights were questioned. Old survey maps were argued over in kitchens, barns, and county offices. Everyone knew the dispute existed, but no one spoke about it openly. In places like this, silence was often mistaken for peace. By the summer of 1958, that silence had worn thin. The agreement itself was simple on paper. A shared boundary would be formally redrawn. Grazing schedules would be staggered. Access to a critical water source would be rotated under fixed dates. It was signed by 15 ranchers, men who had inherited not just land, but pride, reputation, and a belief that backing down meant surrendering more than acreage. They shook hands. They posed for a photograph outside the county office. From the outside, it looked resolved. But agreements do not erase memory. Each signature carried years of resentment beneath it. Some believed the lines favored the wrong families. Others felt pressured by local officials eager to avoid escalation. A few signed knowing full well they had no intention of honoring the terms once the ink dried. The document ended the argument on record, but it intensified it everywhere else. In the days that followed, small violations began almost immediately. Cattle appeared where they shouldn't. Gates were left open. Water troughs were emptied ahead of schedule. Each act was deniable on its own. Together they formed a message. The agreement was not being respected, and neither were the men who signed it. Word traveled fast. Meetings were held in private homes, usually at night. Groups formed along old alliances that predated the contract itself. Brothers stood with brothers. Cousins stood with cousins. Longtime neighbors chose sides not based on the document, but on history. What made the situation more volatile was the absence of clear authority. The county had brokered the deal, but enforcement was minimal. Officials assumed compliance would follow. They underestimated how deeply personal the dispute had become. By mid-July, confrontations were no longer subtle. Voices were raised near fence lines. Trucks blocked access roads. Men stood longer than necessary with their hands resting on doors, belts, pockets. No one wanted to be the first to openly defy the agreement, but everyone wanted the other side to blink. Then came the night of July 18th. It began with an argument over cattle that had crossed a boundary after dusk. Two men who had signed the agreement confronted each other near a water source both claimed rights to. The conversation escalated quickly. Accusations turned personal. Old insults resurfaced. Words were said that could not be taken back. No one knows who made the first irreversible decision. By sunrise, one of the men was dead. The discovery sent shockwaves through the region. Law enforcement treated it as an isolated incident at first, a personal dispute gone too far. But the people living there knew better. They understood what that death represented. It was a declaration. Within hours, fear replaced hesitation. Men who had tried to remain neutral now felt exposed. If the agreement could end with one body, it could end with more. Families pulled children inside earlier than usual. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar vehicles passed by. And still, No one backed down. Instead, the lines hardened. The death didn't pause the conflict. It accelerated it. The agreement that was meant to prevent violence had become the reason for it. Every clause was reinterpreted as provocation. Every perceived violation justified retaliation. Another rancher was found dead 2 days later. Different location, same connection. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Montana authorities increased patrols, but the land was vast, and trust was non-existent. Witnesses were scarce. Everyone knew something, but no one spoke. Each family believed cooperation would leave them vulnerable to the next move. Behind closed doors, strategies were forming. Some men believed restraint would protect them. Others believed restraint was weakness. The agreement had forced everyone into a corner, and now they were choosing how to fight their way out. What made the situation especially dangerous was that no single group claimed responsibility. There was no organization, no hierarchy, no clear leader. Violence emerged from individual decisions, layered on top of collective resentment. Each act fueled the next, creating a chain reaction no one could fully control. The 15 names on the agreement had become targets, not officially, not openly, but inevitably. Each death narrowed the distance between conflict and catastrophe. By the end of July, the land dispute was no longer about boundaries. It was about survival. Men slept lightly. Vehicles were checked before starting. Familiar paths were avoided. Trust, already fragile, disappeared entirely. The agreement still existed on paper. On the ground, it was falling apart in blood and silence. And as rumors spread that more confrontations were coming, one truth became unavoidable. The first death had not been the end of the dispute. It had been the beginning of something far worse. Across Montana, those watching from the outside began to understand that this was no longer a legal matter. It was a countdown, and the people trapped inside it were running out of ways to stop what had already been set in motion. The agreement had failed, and the land was about to collect its price. The second death erased any remaining illusion that the first had been an accident. When the body was discovered near a service road that cut across disputed land, the details barely mattered. What mattered was the name. Another signer of the agreement. Another man who had sat at the same table weeks earlier, pretending the problem could be solved with ink and handshakes. By then, everyone understood the pattern. The agreement had marked its participants. Law enforcement shifted its tone, but not its effectiveness. Deputies questioned neighbors who had known each other for decades. Every answer sounded rehearsed. Every silence felt intentional. No one trusted the authorities to protect them, and no one trusted their neighbors to stay neutral. The community fractured quietly. Men who once shared equipment stopped returning calls. Families who had attended the same church services began sitting on opposite sides of the room. Conversations that did happen were brief, coded, and carefully measured. Everyone was watching everyone else, trying to predict who would move next. What made the situation unbearable was the uncertainty. No one claimed responsibility. There were no warnings, no demands, no messages left behind. The violence arrived without announcement, striking where routine should have made things safe. A morning drive, an evening check on livestock, a stop that had been made 100 times before. Each death amplified paranoia. Some ranchers began altering routines, changing routes, avoiding shared spaces. Others refused to adjust, convinced that showing fear would only invite escalation. Pride hardened into defiance. Men who had never seen themselves as violent started to imagine scenarios where force became necessary. Behind the scenes, the agreement was being dissected clause by clause, not to enforce it, but to justify breaking it. Every line became ammunition. If someone violated one term, others felt released from all of them. What had once been compromise now looked like betrayal. The document had failed to define peace, and without peace, the only language left was retaliation. The third death came quickly. This time, the response was immediate. Rumors spread before officials arrived. Names were whispered. Old grudges resurfaced with renewed intensity. People connected dots whether they existed or not. Guilt became a matter of perception rather than proof. The land itself became symbolic. Every fence post felt like a challenge. Every gate represented control. The disputed area was no longer just valuable, it was dangerous. Whoever dominated it would send a message to everyone else. This ends on my terms. Meetings resumed, but not the kind the county organized. These were private gatherings, held in basements and back rooms. Groups formed along bloodlines and old alliances. No formal plans were written down, but understandings were reached. If something happened to one of theirs, it would not go unanswered. Fear had matured into readiness. By early August, the death toll reached 5. Each loss narrowed the field. 15 signers had become fewer, and with each disappearance, the remaining men felt the pressure intensify. Survival instincts took over. Logic lost ground to emotion. The idea of walking away, selling land, relocating, was dismissed as impossible. To leave now would be to admit defeat, to confirm weakness. The agreement had trapped them. Law enforcement tried to reassert control, increasing patrols and urging cooperation. But authority means little when trust has evaporated. Witnesses stayed silent. Evidence went missing. Tips contradicted each other. Every lead ended in the same place. Nowhere. What officials didn't fully grasp was that the violence wasn't centralized. It didn't come from a single group or leader. It emerged organically, fueled by anger, fear, and the belief that justice was no longer neutral. Each act inspired the next, creating momentum no one could stop. The 6th death marked a turning point. This time, retaliation followed within days. The connection was unmistakable. 2 men who had avoided confrontation until then were now pulled into the conflict. Neutrality became impossible. Choosing not to act felt as dangerous as acting. Families began preparing for outcomes they never imagined. Legal documents were updated. Instructions were given quietly. Children were warned not to ask questions. The conflict seeped into every corner of daily life. The agreement still existed, but it no longer governed behavior. It justified violence. By mid-August, the land dispute had transformed into something else entirely. A war of attrition driven by perceived slights and unspoken rules. Each side believed it was responding, not initiating. Each death was framed as consequence, not cause. And with each passing week, the distance between the remaining ranchers shrank. They were running out of space to hide, out of routines to change, out of ways to pretend this could end without more blood. The agreement had drawn the lines. Now those lines were being crossed one by one. And everyone involved understood a final truth they had avoided since the beginning. The only way this would end was when there was no one left to fight. The countdown continued. By the time the 7th man was found dead, neutrality no longer existed. The ranchers who remained were no longer divided into sides based on the agreement itself, but on something far more primal. Who might strike next, and who might already be preparing to do so. The land dispute had stopped being a legal conflict weeks earlier. Now it was a question of momentum, and momentum was deadly. The 7th death didn't shock the community the way the first had. It confirmed what everyone already feared. The violence was no longer reactive. It had become strategic. Whoever was responsible, whether acting alone or in loose coordination, was no longer responding to provocations. They were shaping the outcome. Law enforcement felt it too. Deputies began speaking less in absolutes and more in probabilities. Patrols increased again, but the land was unforgiving. Miles of open territory, countless access points, and too many people who knew the terrain intimately. The investigation stalled not because of a lack of effort, but because of an absence of cooperation. No one trusted anyone. Those who had once dismissed the agreement as a temporary inconvenience now looked back at it as the last moment before control slipped away. But regret didn't lead to restraint. It led to justification. Each rancher rewrote the story in his own mind, casting himself as defensive, reactive, and morally justified. Behind closed doors, conversations grew darker. Men spoke less about compromise and more about inevitability. If this was going to end, it would end decisively. Half measures no longer made sense. Waiting only increased vulnerability. The question wasn't whether more blood would be spilled. It was whose. The eighth death came quietly. No witnesses, no immediate retaliation. Just another name removed from the list of 15. Another family left trying to understand how a dispute over land had consumed everything they knew. That silence was more frightening than violence. It suggested calculation. Rumors began to circulate that some of the remaining ranchers were preparing for escalation. Trucks were seen moving late at night. Supplies were relocated. Old boundaries were reinforced, not with paperwork, but with presence. Everyone noticed. No one commented. The agreement had become irrelevant except as a list of who had been involved, a list of who was left. By early September, fewer than half of the original signers remained alive. The realization settled heavily over the community. This was no longer a conflict that could be waited out. The remaining men were running out of options, and desperation was pushing them toward choices they might never have considered before. Families urged restraint. Some pleaded. Others demanded action. Fear fractured even households as wives and sons argued over what survival meant now. Leaving the land was discussed again, but abandoning it would mean surrendering everything: property, pride, history. For men who had built their identities around holding ground, that was unthinkable. The 9th and 10th deaths occurred within days of each other. This time, the response was immediate. Whispers of retaliation hardened into preparation. The remaining ranchers understood that restraint was no longer protecting them. If they didn't act, someone else would. The cycle had reached a point where inaction felt like a death sentence. What made the situation especially volatile was that no clear enemy existed anymore. Alliances were fluid. Suspicions shifted constantly. A man considered harmless one week became suspect the next. Trust evaporated completely. The land itself seemed to reflect the tension. Once familiar paths were avoided. Shared resources were treated as traps. Every encounter carried weight. Every glance was interpreted as a signal. Law enforcement attempted one last intervention, proposing renewed mediation, offering protection, urging patience. It was too late. The men involved no longer believed in systems that required time. Time had already taken too much. The 11th death marked the collapse of any remaining restraint. This time, retaliation followed almost immediately. The connection was unmistakable. What had once been a chain reaction was now open escalation. The remaining ranchers were no longer hiding their intentions, even if they never spoke them aloud. The agreement that had started it all was no longer mentioned. Its purpose had been erased by its consequences. With 4 names left on the original list, the conflict reached a dangerous clarity. Everyone involved understood that the end was approaching. The only uncertainty was how many more would be taken before it arrived. Each man believed he was acting to protect himself. Each believed the others had crossed lines first. Each believed history would understand. But history doesn't feel fear. It records outcomes. And as Montana officials watched the situation spiral beyond containment, one truth became undeniable. The agreement hadn't failed because it was unfair. It failed because it forced men already filled with resentment to pretend they were reconciled. The land had not forgotten, and it wasn't finished collecting what it was owed. By mid-September, the conflict had compressed into a space so small, it felt suffocating. 4 names remained from the original 15. 4 men bound not by loyalty, but by the knowledge that survival now depended on anticipation. Every decision was calculated. Every delay felt dangerous. The shrinking circle forced proximity, physical, psychological, inevitable. What had once been a sprawling dispute across miles of land was now a tight, unforgiving standoff. Each of the remaining ranchers knew the same thing. Whoever hesitated would be remembered as the last to fall. The earlier deaths had taught them harsh lessons. Routine was vulnerability. Predictability was invitation. They adjusted accordingly. Movements changed daily. Trusted intermediaries disappeared. Communication became indirect. often filtered through people who claimed neutrality but were trusted by no one. The land, once a source of livelihood, had become a chessboard. Every fence line was a boundary of intent, every water source a potential meeting point, every shared road a risk. The agreement that once attempted to impose order now functioned only as a reminder of how exposed they all were. Law enforcement remained present, but powerless. Patrols passed through at irregular intervals, their presence noted and then dismissed. The ranchers had learned how to exist around authority without engaging it. Cooperation had cost they could no longer afford. Silence, though dangerous, felt safer than honesty. The 12th death shattered what little stability remained. This time it was unmistakably personal. The man killed had publicly argued for restraint weeks earlier. He had urged patience. He had spoken about walking away. That made his death resonate far beyond its immediate impact. If restraint led to the same end as defiance, then restraint had no value. That realization hardened the remaining 3 men. The calculus shifted. Survival was no longer about avoiding conflict. It was about ending it, quickly, decisively, on terms that could not be misunderstood. Behind closed doors, preparations escalated. Vehicles were relocated, supplies were consolidated, family members were moved out of harm's way under pretexts that fooled no one. The land felt emptier, quieter, as if holding its breath. Each of the remaining ranchers believed he knew who was responsible for the recent deaths. Proof didn't matter. Certainty came from pattern, from instinct, from years of watching how grudges formed and how men behaved when cornered. The agreement had reduced 15 to 3, and now it was driving them toward a conclusion none of them could escape. The 13th death came suddenly. This time, retaliation followed within days. The connection was no longer deniable. The conflict had entered its final phase, stripped of ambiguity. Only 2 names remained from the original agreement. 2 men who had once shaken hands. 2 men who now represented the entire weight of the dispute. The community watched in uneasy silence. Everyone understood what was coming, even if no one said it aloud. Conversation stopped entirely. Outsiders avoided the area. Those who lived nearby stayed indoors after dark. This was no longer a series of incidents. It was an ending in motion. Law enforcement made one final attempt to intervene, reaching out through intermediaries proposing temporary relocation, offering protection. The offers were rejected without discussion. Trust had been buried alongside too many men. For the remaining ranchers, leaving now would mean living forever with the knowledge that they had survived by abandoning everything they believed they were defending. That burden felt heavier than the risk ahead. The 14th death ended all pretense. With only 1 signer left alive, the agreement had transformed from a document into a monument. Proof that compromise imposed too late can be more dangerous than open conflict. The last rancher knew it too. He understood that survival now came with consequences no court could address. The land was quiet around him, but not forgiving. Every decision he made carried the weight of the 14 who were gone. Every step forward felt watched, measured, remembered. The dispute that began with boundaries and schedules had stripped away every layer of civility. What remained was stark and undeniable. When agreements are signed without trust, they do not resolve conflict. They concentrate it. As the final days approached, Montana officials could only observe and document. There was no way to undo what had already happened. The agreement had not prevented bloodshed. It had accelerated it by forcing enemies into proximity without reconciliation. And now, with the end approaching, the land stood as silent witness to the truth everyone had avoided since the beginning. This was never just about property. It was about pride, fear, and the moment when men decide that losing ground is worse than losing lives. The final signer did not sleep. Sleep required the belief that morning would come without consequence, and that belief had died alongside the others. Nights blurred into watchfulness, sounds carried meaning, absence carried more. By the time autumn settled over Montana, the land felt emptied of chance. Every path had been measured, every option weighed and discarded. He was the last name on the agreement, and he knew what that meant. For weeks after the 14th death, nothing happened. No new violence, no warnings, no movement that could be confirmed. The silence was not peace, it was pressure. The kind that tightens the chest and sharpens memory. He replayed every argument, every concession, every moment he might have chosen differently. None of it changed the arithmetic. 14 men were gone. He remained. That imbalance alone was dangerous. Law enforcement maintained a presence, but it felt ceremonial. Patrols passed at predictable intervals. Offers of protection were repeated with diminishing conviction. The reality was obvious to everyone involved. Protection could delay an outcome, not prevent it, and delay carried its own risks. The last rancher understood that survival had become a story others were trying to finish. Rumors reached him through people who pretended neutrality. Some said the conflict had burned itself out. Others said the land would not accept an ending with a single survivor. He didn't know which version to believe, but he prepared for both. Preparation became ritual. Routes were altered daily. Vehicles were checked, then checked again. Trusted tasks were delegated to people with nothing to gain and nothing to lose. Even so, trust felt theoretical. In a dispute where everyone believed they were reacting rather than initiating, certainty had vanished. The agreement haunted him. He remembered the day it was signed, the forced civility, the careful phrasing, the unspoken resentment hanging in the air like dust. He had believed then that formal resolution would contain the conflict. He had been wrong. The agreement hadn't contained anything. It had compressed hostility into a smaller space until pressure turned into rupture. The land bore the evidence. Fences repaired and broken again. Roads scarred by heavy use. Places once familiar now avoided. The geography had changed, not physically, but emotionally. Each location carried associations, arguments, threats, losses. As days passed without incident, anxiety grew rather than faded. Silence invited interpretation. Was someone waiting? Watching? Or had the cycle finally exhausted itself? Then came the message. It wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. A vehicle appeared where it shouldn't have been, lingering just long enough to be noticed. A gate left open that had always been secured. Small signals, deliberate and unmistakable. The silence had ended. The last rancher understood the implication. The dispute was not finished until it reached symmetry, until the agreement's consequences were complete. He faced a choice he had avoided for months. He could continue waiting, trusting that the absence of action meant safety, or he could accept what the land had been demanding since the first death, an ending shaped by decision, not hope. The choice was not about aggression, it was about inevitability. The confrontation came days later, not where he expected it, not at a boundary, not near a shared resource. It occurred along a route so familiar it had once felt immune to danger. That familiarity was the point. The conflict had learned to exploit routine, even when routine was constantly changing. What followed was brief. There were no speeches, no explanations, just the culmination of months of fear, suspicion, and justification colliding in a single moment. When it was over, the land fell quiet again, heavier than before. The final name had been crossed out. Authorities arrived after the fact. Documentation replaced speculation. Reports were filed with language that tried to impose order on chaos. The agreement was referenced repeatedly, as if proximity to legality could lend coherence to what had happened. But paper could not explain the outcome. 15 men had signed an agreement meant to resolve a dispute. 15 men had died because of it. No court ruling could reverse that arithmetic. No enforcement action could undo the momentum that had built once trust collapsed. In the weeks that followed, the region returned to a version of normal. Not the old normal, something quieter, more cautious. Properties changed hands. Families moved away. Conversations resumed with careful distance. The land continued producing, indifferent to the names attached to it. Official conclusions varied. Some described the events as a series of isolated incidents. Others framed them as an escalation no one managed to interrupt. The truth lay somewhere between. The violence had not been inevitable, but once initiated, it had fed on itself. The agreement was archived. It became a reference point in reports and studies, cited as an example of conflict resolution gone wrong. Analysts focused on enforcement gaps, communication failures, and historical grievances. All of that was accurate. None of it captured the human cost. Those who lived through it understood something simpler. Agreements require trust. When trust is absent, compromise does not neutralize conflict. It concentrates it. It creates a shared framework where resentment can find targets and justification. The land dispute ended the only way it could given the conditions that surrounded it, with no one left to argue. And as Montana moved forward, the story remained, not as a cautionary tale about land rights, but as a reminder of what happens when resolution is attempted without reconciliation and when pride is allowed to substitute for peace. The land endured. The names did not. Montana's sun rose over a landscape forever altered. The valleys, the plains, the narrow creeks, each carried an invisible weight, an imprint of the blood that had been spilled. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the land had absorbed the violence and refused to release it. Survivors walked cautiously, haunted not only by what had occurred, but by the knowledge that the chain of events could never be undone. Those who remained carried more than grief. They carried fear and calculation. Families adjusted routines, avoiding paths once traveled freely. Community gatherings became smaller, conversations more measured. Eyes scanned the horizon not for beauty, but for danger. The scale of loss, 15 men dead over a land dispute, was impossible to ignore. No legal explanation, no official report could reconcile the enormity of the aftermath. Montana's residents understood something more elemental. When pride and greed collide, the casualties are not limited to those who take up arms. They extend to every observer, every neighbor, every family touched indirectly. The surviving rancher, the one whose name had been last on the agreement, now carried an additional burden. He was a witness, a keeper of a story that could never truly be told in full. He had survived, but survival felt hollow. Each morning brought with it reminders of what had been lost: empty homesteads, unplowed fields, abandoned barns. The land itself seemed to whisper of a reckoning that had passed and yet lingered. Economic consequences rippled as well. Local commerce suffered as trust eroded. Ranchers who had once cooperated now hesitated to lend equipment, to share labor, or to negotiate sales. The network of mutual dependence that had sustained the region weakened under the weight of suspicion. Markets became smaller, prices fluctuated with uncertainty, and families relocated to avoid lingering tensions. Land sales that might have resolved disputes legally now carried a shadow of fear. Ownership, once a source of stability, became a potential liability. Law enforcement attempted intervention, though their presence could not undo months of accumulated hostility. Patrols documented the empty properties, noted threats, and attempted to mediate, but the underlying dynamics remained unaddressed. Fear was not regulated by law, and grudges, once cemented in blood, were immune to bureaucratic intervention. The authorities could investigate, they could file reports, they could issue warnings, but they could not resurrect those who had died, nor could they restore the balance that had been shattered. The surviving families began to reassess their priorities. Some abandoned Montana entirely, leaving the state for urban centers in search of anonymity and safety. Others consolidated land holdings, merging parcels from deceased neighbors to preserve livelihoods while minimizing exposure to potential new conflicts. Even reconciliation between families who had not been directly involved became challenging. Proximity itself was suspect. Every handshake, every shared meal, every exchange carried with it the invisible shadow of mistrust. The psychological toll was immense. Despite all this, life continued. Children grew into adolescence aware of the stories but shielded from the most violent details. They learned early that disputes could escalate beyond comprehension, that decisions made in anger or pride could ripple across generations. Community leaders attempted to teach lessons in negotiation and compromise, hoping to prevent repetition. History became a tool, but it was a blunt one. The bloodshed could not be erased, only remembered. Every surviving participant wrestled privately with their own conscience. The weight of knowing one's role, whether active or passive, haunted dreams. Regret, justification, rationalization, they were constant companions. The concept of justice became malleable, shifting between personal interpretation and the imposed law of the land. What had been intended as a resolution, a signed agreement, had instead become the catalyst for irreversible loss. The cruel irony was unavoidable. Social dynamics in Montana changed permanently. Alliances shifted, trust was carefully rationed, and neighbors became observers first, participants second. The collective memory of violence became a defining feature of the region, shaping behaviors for decades to come. Decisions were no longer solely about livelihood, they were about survival. Every negotiation, every discussion, every land transaction carried the ghost of the 15 lives lost. Even routine disputes over fences, water rights, or grazing schedules now required scrutiny and caution. In the quiet moments, the surviving rancher often returned to the land itself. He walked through fields, inspecting fences, checking barns, noting the absence of those who had once worked beside him. The land did not answer. It held no judgment. It offered no absolution. It simply existed, indifferent to human schemes and tragedies. Yet in that indifference, there was also clarity. Life would continue, the seasons would turn, and while scars remained, survival demanded adaptation. Montana was patient. Humans were not. He understood that the story of the dispute, its bloodshed and aftermath, would never be complete. Even today, those who study Montana history acknowledge the brutal lesson embedded within. Agreements without trust breed death. Pride unchecked by empathy can become lethal. Power, when assumed without accountability, leaves destruction in its wake. Those who witnessed the events, whether firsthand or through stories passed down, learned that justice and violence often share indistinguishable paths when human pride dictates action. In the end, the land was quiet, but silence carried memory. Montana's valleys and plains held the echoes of the blood spilled, the weight of decisions made in haste, and the lessons carved into the very terrain. Life moved forward, slowly, painfully, and with caution. And the surviving rancher understood that he carried not just the legacy of survival, but the burden of ensuring that the lesson endured. Life continued as it always does, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Almost. Revenge doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal wounds. It doesn't restore lost innocence. It only creates new dead, new wounds, new innocence destroyed. The dispute ended, but at what cost? 15 men were dead, families were fractured, and the land itself bore witness to human folly. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. Was it worth it? If this story made you think about justice, revenge, and the price we pay for protecting what we believe is right, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and morality, and about how far we're willing to go when pride and vengeance dictate our actions. Comment below. Where would you have drawn the line in this Montana dispute? Could trust have prevented the tragedy, or was the path to bloodshed inevitable? Because these stories aren't just from the past, they are happening right now somewhere in America, somewhere people are facing impossible choices in a world where respect, fear, and pride collide. Until next time, remember the lessons of history are written not just on paper, but in the lives and decisions of every person who dares to stand their ground. The Montana air grew heavy with tension. The deaths of 15 ranchers had left more than empty homesteads. They had created a vacuum, a dangerous space where fear and rumor thrived. In the town surrounding the disputed land, whispers filled every saloon, every general store, every train stop. The news had traveled fast, carried by riders, telegraphs, and travelers passing through. Some exaggerated the story, others minimized it, but every version carried the same message. The Fontenot, or rather the Stevens, had set a standard in Montana that few dared to challenge. Yet the escalation didn't stop with fear. Families allied by marriage or friendship with the victims began to prepare. Sheds were reinforced, hunting rifles polished, and plans whispered late into the night. Even men who had nothing to do with the original dispute took sides, drawn in by loyalty, revenge, or simply the desire to not be caught unprepared. In Montana, survival often depended on knowing where danger could strike next. The Stevens brothers, now recognized across the county as decisive and ruthless, felt the weight of their actions but carried it with the stoicism that had defined them since childhood. They were men forged by hardship, pride, and the brutal realities of frontier life. While their immediate objective, the men responsible for their father's death, had been achieved, they now faced another challenge: maintaining control over a region where everyone else viewed them with suspicion, hatred, or grudging respect. In the following weeks, small skirmishes erupted across the valley. Not all were deadly, but each confrontation was a test of nerve, strategy, and reputation. A single insult at a bar could ignite a fight. A disputed fence line could provoke armed standoffs. The Stevens brothers moved carefully, calculating each decision to maintain dominance without overextending themselves. They knew every action would be observed, judged, and potentially avenged. Amid this climate, alliances became fragile and fleeting. Some ranchers attempted to broker peace, recognizing that further bloodshed would weaken the entire community. Others, fueled by grief or bitterness, plotted acts of revenge in secrecy. Every man who had witnessed the initial massacre now faced a choice: stay silent and live with the knowledge of cowardice, or act and risk the consequences. Montana's landscape, serene in appearance, had become a stage for a slow-burning war. One particularly tense evening, a caravan of riders approached the main settlement. They were allies of the slain ranchers, men seeking to challenge the Stevens authority. Word of their arrival spread like wildfire. The town's residents hurried to windows, doors, and rooftops, watching shadows elongate against the dim light of dusk. Every creak of a wheel, every hoofbeat carried with it the potential for violence. The Stevens brothers anticipated the confrontation. They gathered in a small barn at the edge of their property, discussing options and contingencies. They were calm, methodical, and precise. Years of hunting, riding, and managing disputes had taught them the value of patience. They didn't need to strike immediately. The tension itself was a weapon. As the night progressed, the two sides circled each other, testing resolve, probing for weaknesses. Verbal threats gave way to gestures, which in turn escalated into shouts and posturing. One misstep could ignite the valley in flames, and both sides knew it. The Stevens brothers, however, had learned from the first wave of bloodshed. Overwhelming force and coordination were their advantages. They relied on it to keep the threat contained, rather than to ignite chaos unnecessarily. Even with their careful planning, the mental toll was immense. Sleep was shallow. Nights were haunted by images of the fallen men, the cries of families left behind, and the knowledge that each action could spiral out of control. Montana's isolation magnified this strain. There was no outside authority to intervene, no neutral arbitrators to mediate disputes. The law existed mostly in theory, while survival depended on instinct, strategy, and reputation. By the end of the week, the standoff had ended without bloodshed, but the message was clear. The Stevens brothers were no longer just avengers. They were arbiters of a fragile peace, and the community had learned that challenging them carried grave risk. Yet the valley remained tense, as if every tree, rock, and river carried a warning. The events of the past months were not easily forgotten. Business resumed in a strained, careful manner. Ranchers worked fields with one eye on the horizon. Families reinforced homes. Children learned to recognize the men who might bring danger, and neighbors whispered strategies for survival. Montana had changed, and those who had survived understood that the peace they now held was precarious. One wrong move, one slight miscalculation, could undo everything the Stevens brothers had fought to achieve. Despite the tension, life continued. Crops grew, livestock reproduced, and the community persisted. but the shadow of revenge and loss hung over every interaction. Montana was a land of resilience, but also of memory, a memory written in blood, etched into the psyche of every resident. The Stevens brothers had won battles, eliminated threats, and secured their father's honor. But the cost was omnipresent. The lessons were painful. Power demanded vigilance, trust was scarce, and survival required unending awareness. As the moon rose over the plains, casting pale light over fields still bearing the scent of conflict, the Stevens brothers reflected quietly. They had acted decisively, preserving their family's legacy and avenging their father. Yet they knew this was not the end. History, Montana, and human nature would ensure that vigilance remained a requirement, and that every choice carried consequences far beyond imagination. Life continued as it always does, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Almost. Revenge doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal wounds. It doesn't restore lost innocence. It only creates new dead, new wounds, new innocence destroyed. The Stevens brothers avenged their father but lost something irretrievable. The simplicity of life before grief and vengeance took hold. They eliminated 15 threats but created countless fractured families. They upheld a code but compromised their own humanity. They won battles but risked losing themselves in the very cycle they sought to end. In the end, only one question remains. One each of us must answer for ourselves. Was it worth it? If this story made you think about justice, revenge, and the price we pay for protecting what we love, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge our understanding of morality, law, and human nature. Comment below. How far would you go to protect your family? Where do you draw the line between justice and vengeance? Because these stories aren't confined to the past. They're happening somewhere right now in neighborhoods and families facing impossible choices. Until next time, remember that the monsters we fear are sometimes made, not born. One broken code, one violated trust, one desperate decision at a time. By the time the smoke cleared over the rolling hills and the bloodied landscape of Montana, the true cost of the Fontenot family's vendetta was impossible to ignore. 15 ranchers had been killed, entire families left shattered. The dispute over land, which had once seemed a manageable disagreement between neighbors, had metastasized into something monstrous. In the aftermath, law enforcement finally began to piece together the sequence of events. The Montana State Police, working alongside local deputies, traced the series of attacks across the county. Every move, every ambush, every calculated strike had been carefully planned. The Fontenots, 4 men bound by blood and the unyielding code of their family, had operated with the precision of a military unit, but the targets were not faceless soldiers. They were neighbors, fathers, and brothers. Lives extinguished over lines drawn in the sand, contracts signed, and property disputes that had spiraled out of control. Across the county, the remaining ranchers and townsfolk lived in a state of suspended fear. Businesses shuttered earlier than usual, cattle drives were postponed, and families barricaded their homes at night. Whispers of the Fontenot family's ruthless efficiency circulated through every small town and settlement. It was no longer just about land. It was about survival, about understanding where the line between neighborly dispute and deadly retribution had been crossed. Yet even as Montana grappled with the immediate chaos, the Fontenots themselves were not immune to the toll of their actions. Sleep became elusive. Every shadow outside the cabin stirred memories of what they had done. Conversations with one another often turned to guilt and justification, debates over what was right and whether justice had truly been served. The brothers questioned themselves and each other, knowing that the law had failed them and that their decision to take vengeance had placed them outside the world of ordinary men. At the same time, the ripple effect of their actions spread beyond the county. Neighboring ranchers spoke in hushed tones about avoiding confrontation with the family. The Montana press ran stories highlighting the severity of the violence, painting the Fontenots as either vigilantes enforcing their own brand of justice or as cold-blooded killers. Each article, each whispered rumor, fed into the legend of the family that had dared to rewrite the rules of engagement in rural America. Despite the fear and the chaos, some in the community attempted reconciliation. Families that had lost loved ones sought to negotiate, to prevent further bloodshed. But by this point, the cycle of retaliation had become almost mechanical. Each act of negotiation, each offer of peace, was measured against the staggering weight of what had already been done. The survivors had to decide whether to continue the cycle or to find a way to break it. And yet, even those who chose restraint carried the invisible scars, the knowledge that 15 lives had ended violently and that vengeance had come at an unthinkable cost. The Fontaneaux, now living in a world that would never be ordinary again, faced a different reality. They had survived, but survival felt hollow. Their actions had protected family honor and settled scores, yet each day reminded them of the fragility of human life and the price exacted by their decisions. The weight of their choices, bloodshed in exchange for control over land and respect, was not something that could be ignored. Every sunrise brought with it memories of faces that would never appear again, the echo of gunfire in the Montana hills, and the knowledge that once a line had been crossed, nothing could restore what had been lost. Life continued, but not as it had before. Scars, both visible and invisible, would linger. Revenge, as they would come to understand, does not restore what was taken. It only leaves new wounds, new families torn apart, new innocence destroyed. The Fontaneaux had avenged themselves, but they had also paid a profound price. They had won a battle, but in doing so, had lost part of their humanity. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. Was it worth it? If this story made you reflect on justice, revenge, and the devastating cost of protecting family at any price, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge our understanding of right and wrong, law and morality, and the boundaries we cross when pushed to the edge. Comment below. What would you have done in the Fontaneau's position? Where do you draw the line between justice and vengeance? These stories are not confined to history. They are unfolding somewhere right now in neighborhoods where the law struggles to maintain order and violence is sometimes the only language left. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear are not always born that way. Sometimes they are made. One broken code, one violated respect, one desperate decision at a time.